Hello. Welcome to Picture Me Coding with Erik Aker and Mike Mull. Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
Good to see you again, Mike. What are you listening to right now?
Your voice.
Oh, how does it sound? Is it pleasing?
It's excellent. Yes.
Oh, good.
High
Coming through
quality.
loud and clear.
High quality voice. So the music I've been listening to, there's a brand new album out from the band Blood Incantation.
Ooh. Let me
And
guess the genre of music. Death metal.
bingo.
Oh, is it? Okay,
Yeah.
I got it.
I thought you were going to say folk or something like that.
Mm.
Yeah, so this is a brand new album. I think it was released really on just a couple of days ago. But I've been listening to the first part of it. The first part of it was out for a few weeks as a quote single unquote, which is ironic because it's a 20-minute track divided into three parts.
Oh,
But
typical metal.
yeah, the whole album is two songs, each of which are divided into three tracks. So it's 6 tracks of about 40 minutes total. It is death metal, but it's also like prog death metal.
Oh,
And they seriously lean into the prog on this one. So they had an album out, I guess it's been quite some time now, almost 5 years ago, called Hidden History of the Human Race, which was kind of like about aliens and stuff. It was a really good album, kind of a critical favorite of that year, but a little bit more metal than prog. This one, it's almost like an homage to prog. so there's like bits of it that are relatively straight death metal, but there's also like elements of yes and elements where you're like, this sounds a little bit like Rush, and there's krautrock elements, and there's one section that sounds pulled straight out of a Pink Floyd album. So anyway, it's interesting. It's alternates between pretty heavy metal and pretty almost over the top prog at times. There's this quote that I grabbed from an article that is supposedly a description of the album by one of the band members. It's the soundtrack to a Herzog-style sci-fi epic about the history of battle for human consciousness itself via a 70s prog album played by a 90s death metal band from the future.
A 90s death metal band from the future. That in itself
Right.
is brain bending.
Yeah. So that sounds really weird, but that is also a really good summary of the album. So
That sounds like something that I want to hear.
I'm not sure you're going to like it, but it is definitely it's unique.
I've been listening to the Mono Chao album that came out this year called Viva 2. It's I don't have much to say about it other than I like it, and it reminds me of the Mono Chao albums that I loved from the past. So if you've ever listened to Mono Chao and enjoyed his music, then you'd probably like this too. Of course, Clandestino was my favorite. That was an amazing record. Did you listen to that? Were you a fan of that one?
I think you actually pointed it to me some years ago now.
Oh, that's a classic. Still great to listen to. I still bring that one up every so often. Anyway, this one's called Viva 2, and it's fun. I like it. It's a little slower, actually, but
I've been listening to it. It does have some really fun tracks. I have to confess, I was a little bit confused at first because the first 3 tracks are in Spanish, French, and English, respectively.
Yeah, that's the classic Mono Chao style. Yep, Spanish, French, English, song to song to song.
But yeah, it's good.
Mike, you told me that with the soon-to-be released Python 3.13, they're going to remove a module from the standard library. The module is the CGI model, the Common Gateway Interface. And I had this brief moment of kind of pining for the early days of the internet.
Yeah, it is a bit of a throwback.
So I thought maybe we should talk about what the internet used to be like, what the web used to be like, and how far we've come, what we have gained, what we lost, maybe. Are you up for it?
We could try it, yeah.
So do you remember This is probably going to go like all the way back to the 90s here. Do you remember that era where CGI bin scripts were the common paradigm for actually running websites? You'd go to websites and you'd see /CGI bin.
I do. I was not really doing a lot of web programming in those days, but like everybody, I was trying to learn about it. And at the companies I was working at, there were people working on it. There had been web stuff had been around for a while at this point, and mostly it was static stuff. So you'd write HTML, and you'd link your documents up, and
You'd FTP
people were
your
using.
static HTML to your server.
Yeah, yeah, or copy it to a NFS mount or something.
Mm-hmm.
But the CGI bin was really kind of like the first sort of common way to do dynamic stuff, and also to give you some capabilities that you couldn't get directly with HTML.
Just static
So
HTML. Now, I have a confession to make. I've never actually written a CGI bin script, but I have copy and pasted some.
I wrote a few that I don't think I ever really built something that you could call production software that was on top of CGI bin. The people that I knew working on it at the time were actually writing the server side code in C,
Mhm.
which was pretty common with early CGI stuff. I think later people were switching to Perl and PHP, but at first it was relatively primitive, and C was one of the options.
Now, do you remember how it worked? I kind of vaguely remember. It was pretty much a script that would run on the server. And the idea was you would have like a web server like Apache would know that this is a known location on the server. If someone comes through looking for a particular file path, because it was really file-based routing at that time, you would have in your URL, in your path, it would be a reference directly to the script. Apache would look up that script and load it. And the idea was we'll put all those scripts in a particular directory. I think if I remember right, they could read standard in and like Apache would just execute them with whatever the URL was, or maybe a request body, and they would write standard out, which was typically just HTML. Oh, and because they're running on a server, you have environment variables too. Does that sound right? Do I have it right? I'm pretty vague on the details.
I think that's roughly right. I remember one of the things I remember is these C programs getting inputs via environment variables, which seems really weird 30 years later. But
So you could write one of these CGI scripts in any language, actually. It didn't have to be C or Python, Perl or PHP. And that's why it was so popular. It was just like this common gateway interface. You could write a script in whatever language you wanted, and Apache would run that script.
correct, yeah.
Now, at the time, there were also Java applets or Java servlets, and I always get confused about the difference. I've never written one of those.
So those are two slightly different things. Servlets, Java servlets were a server-side technology, but applets, which people were super excited about when Java first came out in like 95 or 96 or whenever that was. The idea was that you would go to a particular URL and the Java code would essentially get downloaded to your browser
Oh, right. It was
and
client
run.
side. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. I
Yeah,
forgot about that. Yeah.
yeah, it would run in sort of a what was supposed to be a sandbox in your browser. So so the browser was in a sense the virtual machine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um,
Early competitor to
and
what
people,
JavaScript became, right?
yeah, people were super excited about this idea at first because the phrase that people used was write once, run anywhere. So the you could write Java code and you could run it from the command line or on a server with a virtual machine, but you could also download code into a browser and run it on any browser that supported these applets. And
That sounds great. What could go wrong?
yeah, people were pretty excited about it when it first came out, and it went by the wayside. There may still be some out there, but it kind of went by the wayside over the next decade just because of the security issues and performance issues. And Yeah, a variety of other things. I think mostly security.
Did you ever see any of these things in practice, companies you worked at building these things?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, there was one company that I was at, and they had a pretty substantial portfolio of desktop applications, and some internal folks got really stoked about Java applets and decided they were going to effectively start rewriting all of these Windows desktop applications as Java applets, and really started aggressively marching down that path. And I think it was probably a year or so before people realized that was probably not going to be the way of the future.
That's a bummer. So we bet the farm on Java applets, and then the rest of the world pivoted away from them.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny. What about CGI bin stuff? Do you remember anybody writing any crazy CGI bin stuff?
I wouldn't say crazy. There's this one thing I remember when I was kind of a newbie to the whole thing, where one of the things you could do with CGI bin is you could put an image on the screen. So, before this, if you wanted to click on something to navigate to another page or to perform some action, it had to be a link, a hypertext link.
Right, which would ultimately resolve, it would be like the server would look up just another file, typically, another static file.
Typically, yeah. And so one of the things you could do with CGI bin that gave you some interesting flexibility was you had this idea of, I think they call it an image map. And effectively, what would happen is that you could click on an image, and it would send coordinates to the back end and into your script telling you where the user had clicked. And then you could use that information to figure out like what they had clicked on. People did some interesting things with it, so you could do arbitrary images, and people liked it because it let you do designs that were not hypertexty. They didn't look like text and
Mm-hmm.
boxes and links.
Mm-hmm.
You could do more elaborate designs, and
Yeah, you could throw up a fancy image, and then when somebody clicked on some section of the image, it would
right.
launch the script.
And I remember there was this one company, or I guess it wasn't really a company, but they put this image on a page, and then they sold individual pixels. And the
Sold?
idea was, yeah. And if somebody came along and clicked on your pixel, it would bring up your ad. So anyway, so I remember this one thing where I got into kind of a little bit of a argument with a guy who was working on one of these image map things, because he was using an image map, but essentially what he had done was just made a list of things to click on, and with putting text in rectangles. And I was like, it's interesting that you want to try using this, but this doesn't seem like what this was designed for. I mean, you could just make a list of links to accomplish this. And
Yeah, that seems that's a great example of over-engineered right there. We should put that in the dictionary for
yeah,
over-engineered.
I thought it was funny, but it was harmless, but kind of a silly use of a technology.
Yeah. Now, when I start thinking about this stuff, I have certain things leap to mind. I don't know what you have leaps to mind, but for me, I remember using Netscape Navigator in the 90s. You can actually look up a lot of old websites on the web archive. I looked up, just to kind of refresh my memory, I looked up the early days of Google in 1999 when it was still beta. They had that "I'm feeling lucky," that button. If you clicked it for your search result, it would take you to the very first result. I never clicked that button. Were you an "I'm feeling lucky" clicker? I always wanted to see the results.
I did it a few times, yeah, just to see what I'd get, but did not use it regularly.
But before Google, there was Alta Vista. Remember? Was it Dog Patch? What was the one called Dog something? Was it Dog Patch?
Uh, that sounds right. Alta Vista was my go-to for most of the early internet.
Yahoo was mine.
Um, Alta Vista seemed like it was really good for a while. I was kind of dragged my feet in going over to Google, and then when I did eventually try Google, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is a lot better. I get it now."
Yeah. Way better. Yeah. And they always had that once they had returned a result of queries for your query, they always said this search took, and it was like however many seconds, 0.0017 seconds or something like that. So you were like always being told, we are amazing. This service is amazing that you're using.
I used to really like the show Parks and Recreation, and I enjoyed the fact that if you look closely at the screens in their computers in their government office, they still have Alta Vista on a lot of the browsers, which I thought was I thought was a really fun detail.
Little
That
Easter egg there. In the
yeah,
90s, there was this one of the first things I remember encountering on the internet that like still kind of is shocking to me that existed was there was a site called Dan's Gallery of the Grotesque. And it was these images, which were just like gory pictures. And it was too much for me. I remember it was one of those like college things where somebody loaded it up, like, can you believe this exists? And I don't remember what was on there, but I remember that they did have photos from the crime scene of Kurt Cobain's suicide on there. But you would go to this website and it was like a picture of a house, like a drawn picture of a house, line drawing, and the rooms, quote unquote, represented these different areas of gory things. And it had this whole thesis on why it existed. And the thesis, I'm vague on it. It's not in the web archive, fortunately, probably. But they were making this argument that the internet allows access to information in ways that people had not considered yet. And so, like a site of horrific and grisly images is some sort of artistic statement. I remember being a little bit dubious, finding this dubious at the time. Did you ever encounter this site? This is one of the things I remember from early internet.
I do remember it. I also avoided it, so I was not a fan.
Yeah, I wouldn't have called myself a fan either.
It was. Oh, do you remember those late night commercials for that series of video tapes?
Faces of
Oh,
Death.
Faces of Death. Yeah,
Yeah, it's like that on the web. Yeah.
yeah. It seemed like Faces of Death, and I couldn't really abide that. So
Yeah. Faces of Death or Traces of Death. That was always like the worst kid you know in high school has that.
yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to think a little bit more deeply, not just about the web technologies at the time, but really what a lot of this stuff meant. One of the most important web sites or web applications I used to go to in the early days of the internet, now we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, was the bulletin board or the forum. And I interacted with a few that really had a strong impression on me. And they became like meaningful in my life. These still kind of exist. You know, you still go to online communities where people are actively discussing things. There are some that are pretty anonymous where you don't really know people. They're showing up. I mean, Stack Overflow maybe is an example for software specific stuff. Reddit may be an example. But in the early days, you had these internet communities, these bulletin boards, and people would join and belong to them for so long. They would build up this whole community, and there was this whole feeling of promise. The ones that I visited a lot. This is probably going to sound ridiculous, but one was a Debian forum. Spent a lot of time on the Debian forum asking people how to do Debian things, learning a lot about Debian Linux. And the one that I think probably is most memorable to me was called dreamless.org. Dreamless is something that people often don't talk about now. That, like, I haven't met a lot of people who've heard about it outside of that community, but I formed relationships with people in those days on that site that I still have. I still have relationships with these people to this day that I met on the internet, talking to them about philosophy and art, etc. Dreamless was a site started by a guy named Josh Davis, who's a pretty well-known graphic designer, pretty successful. He started this site as a forum for people in the art and graphic design community to come and talk about stuff, and then eventually it ended like the registration was hard to find. It was a little hidden, so it was kind of a little underground. But I remember going to it. It had this gray palette, and it was constantly getting reshuffled and changed and designed differently. Josh Davis, of course, interested in design. He was like big in Flash, early web technology, Flash there. And that site, when I first encountered it, it was like a list of links, and you click on a link and be discussion, and the discussion would scroll down the page. And users could like post not only text, but they could post HTML, they could post JavaScript. And so sometimes you click on one of these things and it would like the whole page would collapse and people would do weird stuff. And it was like, it felt like something out of Neuromancer. It felt like you were participating in something a little edgy and weird. Uh, it- Josh Davis would famously like people who would meet on that forum would throw parties and they'd get together in real life. And Josh Davis always called these quote unquote riots. It just felt like this weird community. You probably haven't heard of. Have you heard of Dreamless?
I've heard of it. I was not a user, I think, in part because this is kind of the era when I started to have children.
Mm-hmm.
In the early part of the 90s, I was pretty active on Usenet, even though it was still pretty prominent in the 90s. It was maybe more of an 80s technology than a 90s technology. But yeah, I think probably starting in 94 and thereon, I was a little bit out of the loop on popular things like this.
Mm. So I think because I was sort of internet raised on forums like this, when MySpace and Facebook came along and sort of threatened to kill all this stuff off, Facebook always felt to me like completely different. Like this is a walled garden. A forum is a place where you go and have a community and people are sharing things and those things go to other parts of the internet. The internet has this feeling of expansiveness, right? It's huge and you cannot conceive of all the possibilities of it. When something like Facebook comes along, they're like, no, 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 no. You don't ever have to leave. You can play games here. You could talk to your people here. You could see photos here. Just stay here. It's safe here.
Yeah. I remember people talking about how, or I remember at least Zuckerberg talking about how Facebook is a platform and, you didn't need the broader internet. You just needed this platform.
Yeah. It's just like we're going to just go in this little compound and shut the door because there are zombies outside. And I just found that disgusting. But I want to give you an example. So, out of Dreamless, there are a number of other communities that respond, and there were businesses that respond. One of the most successful is called Threadless. Threadless is a place where you can go and buy T-shirts that were submitted by artists. Threadless has become pretty huge, and I think it's an interesting example because it like points to how communities could spontaneously grow out of these internet forums. So here's a little bit of a profile of Jake Nickel from 2011, who started Threadless. He says, and this is I wanted to give it as an example of what it was like at that time on forums like Dreamless. He says, I was on this forum called Dreamless. This is Jake Nickel. It was this group of artists all around the world. It was an invite only forum. So it was really these talented artists. They held this event every year called New Media Underground Festival, where they'd all hang out together and share their thoughts. And I actually went to one of these in 2001 in Chicago. And I met a guy who was the first internet nomad. He had a laptop and a backpack and he traveled around the world working. This was 2001. And I was like, wow, you can do that? That's amazing. Anyway, on Dreamless, Nickel continues, they held a t shirt design challenge on the forum. I entered it and I won. Literally an hour later, after learning that I won, I started Threadless by starting a thread on that forum saying, post up designs and I'll print the best one, make them into t shirts we can all have. This was 2000. It was in the age of the forum that I started Threadless. It worked out pretty well. Even though it's different now, I think that the underlying idea of connecting with people online, just as a communications platform, is still the same. It's just different tools. I find this to be an interesting example. You could just go hang out on a forum, start a t shirt design contest. Someone goes, oh, I'll get these printed. And then boom, something grows out of that.
Yeah, it was a very whole earth catalog sort of stuff back then.
So like Threadless wasn't really business. He just started dumping money into t-shirts. There was something funny too that he said in this interview where he says, well, we had a lot of users in the UK. So a lot of e-commerce businesses, this is 2000, they wouldn't ship internationally. It was uncommon. He says, that was something I never second guessed because there are people on the forum who live there. I want to be able to ship them shirts. A lot of e-commerce companies wouldn't do international in the beginning because it's too hard or something. But for me, it was just a given because that's where the people are. It was like it was virtually run as a nonprofit. It was like they just had there was this sense of spirit and possibility. And I remember that feeling from the early days of the internet. Anybody can write a CGI bin script. Anybody can throw up a site. And there's this feeling of infinite possibility. Stuff is happening. Small communities of people are making things possible. So I kind of wonder if do you remember that? Did you ever have that feeling? Anything's possible.
I think that was pretty characteristic of the early web. We had talked about web rings too, which was this kind of interesting idea where you'd have a community of websites that were kind of semi-related, and you'd make this ring so you could go from one to the next. And
Yeah.
um,
It was like a
you know,
trust
there's
ring, like, oh, I like this content creator. Who are their friends?
right. And it was very much in the spirit of the hypertext idea.
Hmm.
And at that time, this may have been a little bit earlier than the era you're talking about, but I know that in the early '90s, like on the Usenet sites and stuff, prior to that time, there was this famous line about the internet interprets censorship as damage and routes around it or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's the information wants to be free thing. That was at the root of a lot of stuff, right?
Right. And I remember in the early '90s, people talking about on Usenet about how the internet was now dying or the internet was dead because people were trying to monetize it, and people were
Mm.
the physical links were being commercialized, and eventually this sort of idea of information being free and being able to put up your own content easily and share it with the world and do it in your own way was giving way to people trying to make money and people trying to force you onto their platforms and even AOL was kind of that way. I don't know if anybody remembers AOL now, but AOL was kind of trying to do in a much more limited way what Facebook was trying to do later, where you know people using AOL didn't really think of themselves as going onto the internet. They thought of themselves as going onto
Oh, I
AOL.
remember. Yeah, there used to be confusion about that. They would mail out those CD-ROMs to every house in the country, pretty much.
Yeah, I had this huge collection of AOL coasters back in the '90s.
Now, this is fun to think about, but it actually makes me think, well, wait a minute. This is starting to sound like nostalgia. And nostalgia is one of those kind of dangerous feelings or perspectives to wander into because it's almost never accurate when you were pining for this previous era. So I guess I want to be a little more clear eyed with you. There was some cool stuff back then, right? Are you nostalgic for it?
There are days and I do to some extent agree with this idea that when people started to try to make money off content, and when people started to build these platforms that sort of took people away from the more general principles of the web, I do think that was bad in many senses of the word. On the other hand, I also remember that what you could do in terms of internet application was very limited.
Hmm.
I remember that in the mid '90s, there were still quite a lot of people dialing into the internet over modems.
Hmm. Yeah, scale wasn't much of a concern at the time for most 90% of everybody who threw a website up there because there weren't that many people on the internet.
Yeah, there weren't that many people, and I didn't have a modem then, but I was probably still on something like ISDN or something like that, where it was the bandwidths were kilobytes rather than megabytes and gigabytes, and
Yeah, stuff was slow. You'd go
so
to pages and it would load like one line at a time.
yeah, um, and stuff like Gmail, which I now sort of take for granted, would have been impossible in that era.
Oh, that's true, actually. Yeah. So I guess I wanted to think then, what were the downsides to maybe some of the technologies in use at the time? What were the good things about them? I think one thing we could say is a good thing. People would talk a lot about how the internet is democratizing access to information. And part of that is that anybody can join and roughly, not really. I mean, if you have an internet connection, you can, but if you have the connection, you can go out there, you can have access to the information, and anybody can publish. So it's like the tools for publication are put in everybody's hands. But with this zoo of information out there, it becomes harder to find things that you actually want or even reliable things, right?
Yeah, it's it's also kind of funny to realize. in retrospect that a site like Yahoo, the original incarnation of Yahoo, could exist. I mean, can you imagine now if you had to go to a site to find something, if you had to go to a site that was just a hierarchy of lists?
Yeah, that kind of sucks. But you could go to Google at that time, and when you search for stuff, you would actually be searching for stuff. And I don't think I'm alone in feeling like that's not that really my experience with Google nowadays. I don't really get results the same quality of results I used to.
There was definitely a different way of putting the paid stuff in front of you. I don't know that it was always so great, but now it seems like when I go to Google, I get a bunch of sponsored links, and then I have to scroll down to something that is not sponsored.
Hmm.
Um, but I also remember in those days you'd have like these sidebar ads that are relatively rare now.
Hmm. Well, you would also sometimes go to a site and it would spawn a bunch of browser windows.
Yeah.
So my wife and I were watching on Netflix. There's a documentary about Ashley Madison. I was surprised. I didn't realize Ashley Madison, the website it's kind of like a dating website for people who are married to cheat on their spouses. That was what the pitch was. I didn't realize they started in 2001 and they were hacked in 2015 and it pretty much took the company down. There was a huge amount of schadenfreude when they were hacked. Schadenfreude is like joy over someone's misfortune, that great German word. And I should have looked this up, but I remember reading at the time that they were hacked via SQL injection. They had PHP sites, and SQL injection used to be pretty common. People would copy paste PHP solutions to things, and you could just type arbitrary SQL queries into web forms and have it dump out the entire database for you. In the documentary about Ashley Madison, the people who worked there said, "Yeah, we didn't take security that seriously." So maybe this is one of the downsides at that time. Internet security practically didn't exist in the late 90s, early 2000s.
That's true. I can't even remember now when SSL started to become a common thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Flash, another thing. Flash was this technology that was proprietary. You had to use their builder to build these programs and dump them out and they would run on the internet.
yeah, another great Adobe product. If you missed that on Flash, thank your lucky stars.
I made some stuff in Flash. I made a few things in Flash. It was kind of cool. It felt like, oh, I'm like an animator. I'm animating things with Flash. It was pretty cool.
If you say so.
Yeah, it wasn't that easy to work with. And then like now you go to every single website wants you to confirm your cookie settings. That didn't exist, so that was pretty cool.
That's true. Although I don't remember when third-party cookies became a common and pernicious thing. I suppose having the GDPR and the cookie settings is a good thing in the sense of if you're going to have those things, it's nice to be able to opt out of them if you want to.
So I guess the overall thesis I would have here, or the overall idea that emerges for me is back then there was this feeling of promise and possibility. You could have people meet on a forum and then they have spontaneous community actions that they would take. And it would lead to interesting results. There was this energy, this fire, this feeling of possibility. And now the internet doesn't feel like that so much to me. And I guess I feel a little disillusioned that at some point, the primary the primary mode of conducting business on the internet became, well, get a bunch of users and show them ads or scams, or we will sell you everything. We sell you furniture and shoes and coffee and stuff. It's kind of a little bit of a bummer.
I am not philosophically opposed to e-commerce. I guess with e-commerce, it didn't feel like that was taking away from people's creativity. I mean, there probably were better ways to buy things or barter things pre Amazon, but I don't think there were a lot of people who were going to set up their own stores. But yeah, I think this may be an aspect of your nostalgia can be bad argument, but I think the nerdier you are, the less appealing things became.
Hmm.
Because I think the appealing thing about the 90s was there was this kind of idea that, I'm in control here. I can generate my own content. I can serve my own content. And it felt like you were both contributing to something
Yeah.
and also plugging into something.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are good words. Yeah.
But the reason I say I think that mostly appealed to nerd types is because realistically, nobody was going to set up their own servers. Nobody's going to serve content over their modem line.
Hmm.
So probably things like Facebook and Amazon and so forth were more appealing to people who did not have any thoughts about serving their own content.
Hmm. Well, I have to say, if anybody's listening to us and they're curious about what some of the stuff looked like in the late 90s, early 2000s, you can go to the web archive, the Wayback Machine, and you can look at Amazon.com or Google.com or eTrade.com, or sorry, eBay. You can look at eBay.com in those early days and see what they looked like. And for those of us who remember, we may be a little nostalgic about it. And that nostalgia might be kind of a dangerous, like rose colored glasses looking at the past. But I also wonder, Mike, if maybe this whole conversation is sort of moving around the Cory Doctorow thesis. Cory Doctorow, a couple of years ago, authored this blog post that was published in Wired, and he coined the term enshittification, which has now become, like, they added it to like a dictionary. It's been so widely used. So we may be just sort of talking about Cory Doctorow's overall point here, that things on the internet get shittier over time. He actually talks about the original paper written by the creators of Google, and they talk about in that paper how search engines eventually become antagonistic to their users' interests because they really need to please advertisers to stay in business. So the interests of the advertisers and the users are fundamentally at odds. I want to read to you a section from Dr. O's blog post, which is very good, worth reading, published in 2022. He writes, "This shell game with surpluses is what happened to Facebook. First, Facebook was good to you. It showed you the things the people you loved and cared about had to say. This created a kind of mutual hostage taking. Once a critical mass of people you cared about were on Facebook, it became effectively impossible to leave because you'd have to convince all of them to leave too and agree on where to go. Then, Facebook started to cram your feed full of posts from accounts you didn't follow." And at this point, for those of us following along with this essay, you can kind of immediately think of examples: Instagram, Twitter, whatever. Everybody did this, right? Anyway, continuing on, Dr. O writes, "At first, it was media companies who Facebook preferentially crammed down its users' throats so they would click on articles and send traffic to newspapers, magazines, and blogs. Then, once those publications were dependent on Facebook for their traffic, it dialed down their traffic. First, it choked off traffic to publications that used Facebook to run excerpts with links to their own sites as a way of driving publications into supplying full text feeds into Facebook's walled garden. This made publications truly dependent on Facebook. Their readers no longer visited the websites, they just tuned into them on Facebook. Eventually, it gets worse. Now, Facebook starts to cram more ads into the feeds, mixing payola from people you wanted to hear from with payola from strangers who wanted to commandeer your eyeballs. What do you think? Are we just rehashing Dr. O's thesis here that everything becomes shittier on the internet because of the needs of businesses that are running these websites?
To a certain extent, we probably are. I think there are some things that have happened that are not exclusively due to, people trying to
Monetize.
make money and monopolize and so forth. Facebook is also probably responsible for this, but the disinformation stuff that we've been seeing for the last basically a decade now,
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely shitty, but it's not clear that it's people trying simply to make money.
And yeah, there's part of the disillusionment there too. Back in the early days of the internet, you had access to all kinds of information. It never occurred to me that having access to information would be like someone would see that and go, "Oh, let's poison this well." It seemed like that'd be a very hard task because there's so much information out there. But it's possible that when you condense the sources that people go to for information, poisoning the well becomes easier because it's one one or fewer wells.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, there's sort of a converse thing there where there is now so much stuff that if you just repeat something enough and put it in enough places, people will start to give it some credence. And I think this is something that it's always been that way. You can read things about the Hearst family trying to use their newspapers to affect political opinion, stuff like that in the 19th century. But I think just the extent and the variety of things out there make it easy for people to not necessarily persuade you, but sort of put you in this position where it's really hard to know what's true anymore.
Yeah, Dr. O talks about monetization actually as maybe involved here. Let me just finish this one sentence, this line of thinking about Facebook. He says, today, Facebook is terminally enshittified, a terrible place to be, whether you're a user, a media company, or an advertiser. It's a company that deliberately demolished a huge fraction of the publishers it relied on. But then he pivots to talking about this monetization idea. And I think this is sort of involved in what we're talking about. There was so much information in the early days of the internet, but it's like you can't just run it you can't run everything for free. There's this information wants to be free thing, but does it really want to be free, or does it want some money to help it become available to be distributed, to be broadcast? Dr. O says, monetize is a terrible word that tacitly admits there's no such thing as a, quote, attention economy. You can't use attention as a medium of exchange, he writes. You can't use it as a store of value. You can't use it as a unit of account. Attention's like cryptocurrency, a worthless token that is only valuable to the extent that you can trick or coerce someone into parting with fiat currency in exchange for it. You have to monetize it. That is, you have to exchange the fake money for real money. So apparently the problem here is if our business plan is, well, first we'll get a whole bunch of users, and then our business plan part two is, and then we'll make a lot of money. What Dr. O is really ultimately arguing is, yeah, that's like a contradiction right there. You're going to monetize them and you're trying to exchange the users for money, and you're ultimately going to do stuff that's horrible for them. And it's almost like the internet, the technologies that have developed to build these web applications, the scaling, the massive things that we can do nowadays, they've been built on the backs of this attention economy, trying to get as many users as possible to do what? What are we selling them in the end?
I like this analogy to cryptocurrency. I bought in pretty heavily to the idea of the attention economy in like the mid 2000 aughts when I was doing music recommendation stuff. And I think I came to the same conclusion. Our sort of noble purpose was to expose the long tail of stuff to people. So they hear something which is popular or which is playing on the radio, and then you can direct them to things that are less popular in the long tail that are similar, so that stuff gets some exposure. So I think there was this idea of you're competing for people's attention, but if you do it in the right way, you're actually enhancing their experience. And it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that was not going to be the best way to, as he says, monetize.
To run a business, to get money, to keep going.
To turn that attention into dollars. That was probably not the best way to go. And probably things like YouTube have been the worst at that. But all of these things that we're trying to get, I mean, the idea switched from exposing people to interesting things to exposing them to anything that will make them engage longer.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark pattern right there. There's like 3 ways to get money out of having lots of people come to your website, it seems like. One is show them lots of ads. 2 is scam them. 3 is sell them products. And I have this very naive like memory of having a very young perspective on the internet, which is wow, there's so much information out here, and that will just magically always be there. Dr. O talks about the bellheads and the netheads. Technological self determination is at odds with the natural imperatives of tech businesses. They make more money when they take away our freedom to speak, to love, to connect. So here's a fundamental conflict. The internet, the monetization, which Dr. O makes fun of, but making money off of internet projects means that we have all this technological innovation that gets pushed into them. But there are also people like this is the open source spirit too, who just want to build and explore and experiment and make information available for free to everyone. And these two things, they feed off of each other, but they also work at competing goals.
I'm not entirely sure I understand his argument at the end. It sounds initially like he's saying the netheads are doing something good, and then uh, the last part seems to be a reversal of that. So,
Well, he's saying they make more money than like the companies, right? He's saying that the internet. You look at the history of the internet, and it represents freedom. And every company that exists on the internet has as like a its teleology, what it's pointed at, its fate, its destiny is to restrict freedom and to get shitty. That's his thesis. They offer you something that seems cool for free at the beginning to suck you in, and then it just gets crappier and crappier over time. Like that's a pretty cynical take, but I find it compelling when I think about how cool stuff used to be in the early days, and it doesn't seem as cool now. And I might just feel that way because I'm suffering from nostalgia.
and you're a nerd, so I I wonder about this sometimes too. I mean, there's so many things now that so think of it this way: what is some technology that you feel like you would really be reluctant to have taken away from you at this point in time?
Oh, probably
Um,
SQL databases.
well, I mean, like as a consumer
Oh,
or a user, for me, I think it's Google Maps. I don't think I could. I would really object if somebody tried to take Google Maps away from me at this point in time. It's just such an essential tool for me.
hmm.
Um,
So you like how it says, "Oh, you want to get over here? You want to get to the museum? Turn right at the McDonald's, Mike. There's a McDonald's. They've got a special on coffee."
yeah, I mean, it doesn't always work, and sometimes I get annoyed at the fact that it's trying to upsell me on going to the McDonald's, but it does a thing, and uh, it's a it's a tool that has utility, I believe.
Hmm.
But then I look at things like Facebook and Instagram, and the thing that perplexes me about these things is, all this bad stuff that we're saying about them, I feel is true, but also I don't really need those things, and I can't figure out why we haven't just abandoned them.
Hmm.
I know that you mentioned that thing about sort of this mutual hostage thing where you reach a certain critical mass where you feel like you have to stick with it because all your friends are there too, and you can't make your friends move. But I've kind of reached the point where I don't really care if my friends are there. I'd rather find better ways to interact with my friends. So, um,
I guess I would. I guess the takeaway for me is it's pleasing to have a community on the internet, but if that community is provided as a service by a business, there's no way it's going to continue to always be the community that you want. Like it has to be a free, open resource. It has to be like a nonprofit to stay a community. You need like this common space to come together and socialize with people in your life. And maybe that's sharing pictures, but as soon as it becomes there's somebody else who wants to insert themselves because they need to make money so that they can continue to run these servers and serve all your traffic, then it sucks. It gets shitty. I think Dr. O's right about that.
yeah, that seems true. If you go to the pub to hang out with your buddies, you don't expect them to have billboards with them or to try to sell you insurance or something. So it's
Or just before they're going to tell you a story from work, there's some ad that you have to listen to. Can you imagine what a nightmarish experience that would be?
Yeah, this really cool thing happened to me at work. But first, a word from my sponsor.
Well, thanks for going down this tour of nostalgia for the early days of the internet with me. Maybe not quite early. Maybe this is just past early days, mid 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. The technologies at the time seemed so simple and so graspable, and they're so different from what we're using now.
Yeah, except for Wikipedia. Wikipedia is pure.
All right, Mike. Thanks so much for chatting with me this week. This has been Picture Me Coding with Erik Aker and Mike Mull. I'll see you again soon, Mike.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.